This is apropos. The escalation has triggered fears in Venezuela of a full-blown conflict with the United States. An American naval strike force featuring the world's largest warship has arrived in the Caribbean as Caracas announces its own massive deployment. At least 76 people have been killed since the US began striking boats initially in the Caribbean and more recently in the Eastern Pacific, where vessels off Mexico have been targeted with the stated aim of countering drug trafficking. With the latest, here's Liz Kamnoff.
It's over 330 metres in length with 4,500 sailors on board. The world's largest aircraft carrier, the USS Gerald R. Ford, is the latest arrival in the Caribbean. A US naval buildup off the coast of Venezuela is raising tensions in the region. The Trump administration says it's preparing for an anti-drug offensive, deploying warships, submarines and fighter jets near the Venezuelan coast. With heavy US military presence at its shores, Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro signed a defense law on Tuesday calling for military readiness.
If we as a republic, as a people, have to take up arms to defend this sacred legacy of our liberators, we are ready to win.
Venezuelan Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino claims to have rallied 200,000 armed forces to participate in military exercises to counter what he calls imperial threats. Meanwhile, neighbour Colombia also denounced Donald Trump's military buildup in the region, calling for an investigation into Trump's war crimes, which it says has affected citizens of Venezuela, Ecuador, Colombia and Trinidad and Tobago. Its president, Gustavo Petro, ordered his security forces to stop sharing intelligence with the US until US strikes on suspected drug traffickers cease.
All levels of law enforcement intelligence are ordered to suspend all communications and other dealings with US security agencies.
Since September, US forces have targeted about 20 vessels in international waters, killing over 75 people, according to US figures. Trump recently downplayed the prospect of going to war with Venezuela, yet has warned that President Maduro's days are numbered.
For more, we're joined now by Brian C. Finucane, Senior Advisor for the US Programme at the International Crisis Group. Brian, thanks so much for being with us on the programme this evening. Firstly, how significant is the arrival of this aircraft carrier, the world's largest in these waters in the Caribbean? How much higher does it raise the stakes here?
Well, it's a significant step in the pressure campaign waged by the U.S. government against Maduro in Venezuela, a pressure campaign with the ultimate objective of regime change.
And is it an indication, as some observers have suggested, that military action might be imminent, or is it simply, do you think, a further flexing of the US's military muscle?
We don't know. Certainly the U.S. president has alluded to and mentioned the possibility of conducting not just strikes at sea, but also strikes on land. Concerningly, the U.S. government has referred to not just the victims of these boat strikes as supposed narco-terrorists, but also Nicolas Maduro himself. They've labeled him a narco-terrorist, and they've alleged that Maduro leads the so-called Cartel de los Soles, which is comprised of allegedly comprised of senior Venezuelan military officers, which the U.S. government has also labeled as a terrorist organization. So they're using the rhetoric of counterterrorism and counter-narcotics to cloak a regime change program. And the concern is that there may actually be direct U.S. military action against Venezuela. But reportedly, the president has yet to decide on that course of action.
And is there a danger here, Trump? We all know how unpredictable Donald Trump is. He seems to change his mind, sometimes from day to day. Is there a chance that he and the US will somehow stumble into war here?
Certainly, there's ample potential for accident or miscalculation with these deployments, an incident potentially between Venezuelan armed forces and U.S. armed forces at sea. And as you said, the president is difficult to predict and could change his mind about this whole regime change project and order the removal of U.S. forces from the Caribbean. Or alternatively, he could carry through with his musings about strikes on land. And so it's a moment of what should be great concern for the American public and for the U.S. Congress, which actually has the legal authority over these uses of force. The legal authority the White House has usurped here.
And concerns also being raised here in Europe. The Secretary of State, US Secretary of State, he might be facing questions from allies over the legality of these military operations that the US has been carrying out in the Caribbean, in the Pacific. In your view, do the strikes violate international law? Washington claims that they don't.
Well, a broad range of international legal experts, former U.S. government lawyers who advise on counterterrorism, and figures of the United Nations have condemned these strikes as unlawful, condemned them as extrajudicial killings. It's very notable that the United Kingdom reportedly suspended some intelligence sharing with the U.S. government over its legal concerns about these strikes. And it indicates to me that the U.S. government has just been unable to put forward a convincing legal argument to foreign allies and partners to justify these strikes.
And the Colombian president also now ordering his security forces to stop sharing intelligence with the United States. What kind of consequences might that have?
Well, I think it's to be determined exactly how that will play out in terms of U.S.-Colombian relations. But I think it's indicative of broader concern around the world by many U.S. partners and allies about these strikes, about U.S. policy towards Venezuela, and whether the United States will, in fact, engage in an illegal attack upon that country. And if that happens, I think you might see further restrictions in cooperation with the U.S. due to additional legal concerns.
And do you think Nicolas Maduro himself is taking the threat seriously? You know, we've been seeing in public comments that he's trying to downplay all of this, but at the same time deploying significant resources himself with this threat looming.
Based on both public reporting and what I hear from my international crisis group colleagues in the region, it does seem as though Maduro is taking the threat of potential U.S. military action seriously. And again, it's concerning that the U.S. government has labeled not just people on these boats as narco-terrorists, but also Nicolas Maduro himself. That could potentially pave the way for U.S. military action directly against Maduro.
And do you think it's possible that he will eventually be forced to resign or perhaps forced into exile? How do you think all of this is going to play out?
So I think the hope on the part of the U.S. government, and this is a policy largely driven by Secretary of State Marco Rubio, but the hope was this military buildup in the Caribbean, this flexing the gunboat diplomacy would convince Maduro to step aside or embolden some in his government to oust him. That obviously has not happened yet, and I see no evidence that it is likely to happen in the near future. And that, therefore, that tees up the potential for further escalation, again, including potential direct attacks by the U.S. on Venezuela to further ratchet up the pressure.
And you mentioned Marco Rubio there. Is all of this being driven essentially by the US Secretary of State? Is there evidence of any kind of internal divisions in Washington?
So there are multiple views within the Trump administration. At the moment, the U.S. Secretary of State is understood to be driving U.S. Venezuela policy, understood to be behind the military buildup. But the president may change his mind. The president in the past has changed his mind with respect to U.S. military operations. In the spring, he did a U-turn on the U.S. bombing campaign against the Houthis in Yemen and called an abrupt end to that. So it's possible that the president will change his mind and grow tired of Secretary of State Rubio's regime change project in Venezuela.
And if the regime change project is successful, what then for Venezuela if Maduro is overthrown or does go into exile?
Well, it's highly uncertain. And the path from ousting Maduro to stable democracy is not necessarily going to be a clean or a neat one. And so there should be no illusions in Washington that regime change would be an easy or clean policy approach. It hasn't turned out that way the last 20 plus years in the U.S. military interventions in the Middle East. There's no particular reason to think it will turn out that way in Venezuela.
There is a real chance then that the country would be further destabilised by such an outcome. Is there any scenario where it might actually be in a better position without Maduro?
mean, this is all highly speculative, but certainly in some scenarios, it could be better outcomes than others. But again, it's highly uncertain that U.S. military intervention would succeed in ousting Maduro. It's highly uncertain that it would lead to a better situation for the people of Venezuela, for the people of the region, or even in terms of President Trump's own stated interests. The president has emphasized his concerns about illegal immigration from Venezuela, about drug trafficking, and his interest in Venezuela, petroleum. U.S. military intervention against Venezuela could actually be detrimental in terms of all of those interests if it destabilized the country.
And is there a risk here? We're seeing, of course, today Donald Trump coming under pressure, the Epstein files, again, very much on the agenda here. Is there a risk that he might act, rather hastily here as perhaps a distraction tactic? Or what do you think, how is this going to play out over the next few days, do you think?
I mean, it should be deeply concerning that we even have to have this conversation. But no, I do think that's a risk. And that is inherent in the fact that the U.S. President has accumulated tremendous unilateral power to wield military force without the approval of the U.S. Congress. We've seen that repeatedly under this president, these strikes on Iran over the summer, the strikes on Yemen, these strikes at sea. So there appear to be very few working guardrails within this administration restricting the president from taking military action, even when it would be illegal. And so it's hard to predict, how the president will wield that, and it's always a possibility.
Brian, we'll have to leave it there for now, but thank you so much for being with us on the programme. That's Brian Finucane, Senior Advisor for the US Programme at the International Crisis Group.